April 1941, North Africa. German generals laughed when they saw intelligence files on Australian soldiers, dismissing them as soft colonials from a peaceful island who'd crumble within days against the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. But when the first Australian prisoners arrived at their camps, Nazi doctors stood in stunned silence, measuring physical specimens unlike any soldiers they'd encountered in conquered Europe. Men who towered over their captors with bone density and muscle mass that defied explanation. What had the harshest continent on Earth done to these men that transformed them from mocked underdogs into warriors so formidable that Rommel himself would write, "The German soldier has found his master"? The desert sun beat down on the German command tent like a hammer on an anvil. Inside, General Erwin Rommel stood over a wooden table covered with maps and papers. The Afrika Korps had just arrived in North Africa, and the air smelled of diesel fuel, hot canvas, and confidence. Rommel's officers crowded around him, their faces gleaming with sweat. They had conquered France in 6 weeks. They had rolled through Poland in 28 days. Now they were here to save their Italian allies and push the British into the sea. One officer held up a file marked with British flags, intelligence reports, information about the enemy forces they would face. He flipped through the pages and stopped at a section labeled Australian 9th Division. The officer smiled. Then he laughed. Other officers leaned in to look. Soon, the whole tent filled with the sound of German laughter. "Convict descendants," the report said. The officers loved this detail. They joked that England had sent its criminals to Australia 100 years ago, and now their children were playing soldier in the desert. One captain slapped the table and said the Australians probably didn't even know how to march properly. Another said they were farm boys and sheep herders from a peaceful island on the other side of the world. An island where nothing dangerous ever happened. An island where men grew soft under the sun. The numbers in the file made the Germans even more confident. The average Australian soldier stood 5 feet 9 inches tall. He weighed 165 pounds. These measurements seemed small to men who believed in German physical superiority. The officers had trained in the finest military academies in Europe. They had studied warfare since they were teenagers. They wore uniforms that represented 200 years of Prussian military excellence. What could some colonials from the far edge of the empire possibly do against them? Rommel studied the maps. His finger traced a line to a small port city on the Libyan coast, Tobruk. British and Australian forces had gathered there. The port mattered because it could supply armies. Whoever held Tobruk controlled the coastal road. Whoever controlled the coastal road could advance or had to retreat. The mathematics seemed simple. Rommel had 100,000 troops coming. The defenders had maybe 36,000. The Germans had tanks, artillery, and the Luftwaffe flying overhead. The standard calculation gave Germany a 3-to-1 advantage. By every rule of warfare, Tobruk should fall in 48 hours. Maybe 3 days if the defenders felt stubborn. But then something unexpected happened. On April 10th, German forces hit the Australian defensive positions outside Tobruk. The blitzkrieg tactics that had terrified Europe rolled forward. Panzer tanks rumbled across the sand. Stukas screamed down from the sky. Artillery shells exploded in massive clouds of dust and fire. The attack was supposed to scatter the defenders like sheep. It was supposed to send them running back to their ships. The Australians did not run. They dug in deeper. They fired back. They held their ground. German soldiers who had walked through French defenses now stumbled into a different kind of fight. The Australians moved at night like ghosts. They set up ambush positions. They knew exactly where to hit and when to disappear. After 2 days of fighting, Rommel's officers stopped laughing. After 3 days, they stopped smiling. The soft colonials were not soft. The amateur soldiers fought like professionals. Something was very wrong with the intelligence reports. Inside Tobruk, a man named Leslie Morshead commanded the Australian 9th Division. Morshead did not look like a typical general. Before the First World War, he had been a teacher. He had kind eyes and a quiet way of speaking. But he had fought in the trenches of France 25 years earlier. He had seen what modern warfare could do to men. He had learned that survival meant thinking differently than the enemy expected. Morshead walked through the defensive trenches as shells exploded in the distance. The sound was like continuous thunder. Dust hung in the air so thick that men could taste it on their tongues. The temperature climbed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers crouched in holes carved into the earth, their shirts dark with sweat. Some had wrapped cloth around their faces to keep out the sand. Others squinted against the bright sunlight that reflected off every surface like broken glass. The general stopped to talk with his men. These were not the soldiers the Germans expected. Many had grown up on cattle stations in the Australian outback. They had worked on sheep farms where the nearest neighbor lived 50 miles away. They had mined for gold in places where the summer heat reached 120 degrees. They knew how to survive when water was scarce. They knew how to work when their bodies screamed for rest. They knew how to stay calm when death walked close by. One private sat cleaning his rifle. He stood 6 feet tall and weighed 190 pounds. His hands were huge, scarred from years of hard labor. His skin was burned dark brown from years under the Australian sun. The German intelligence report would have called him average. In person, he looked like he could bend steel bars. Next to him sat another soldier, even bigger. Then another. The trench seemed full of giants. Morshead looked at his men and then looked out at the desert where German forces gathered for another attack. He thought about the enemies who had mocked these soldiers. He thought about officers sitting in comfortable tents, reading files, making assumptions. Those officers believed that European training made better soldiers. They believed that military tradition mattered more than raw toughness. They believed that because they had conquered so many nations, they would conquer this one too. But Morshead knew something the Germans did not know yet. He knew that his men were not Europeans. They did not come from cities with paved streets and regular meals. They came from the harshest continent on earth, a place where nature did not forgive mistakes, a place where weakness meant death. These men had been training their whole lives without knowing it. Every day in the outback had been a test. Every summer had been a trial. Every hardship had made them harder. The general smiled slightly. Let the Germans come with their tanks and their confidence. Let them bring their assumptions and their mockery. This desert would teach them what his men already knew. Survival belonged to the toughest. And nobody was tougher than a man raised by the Australian sun. Morshead gathered his officers in an underground bunker 15 feet below the surface. The air was cooler down there, but still heavy and hard to breathe. Candles flickered on a makeshift table made from old crates. The general spread out a hand-drawn map of Tobruk's defenses. His plan was simple but dangerous. He called it aggressive defense. Most armies that got surrounded sat still and waited for rescue. Moorehead's men would attack. Every night, Australian patrols would crawl out into no man's land. They would move between 800 and 1,200 yards into German positions. They would gather intelligence. They would set up ambushes. They would make the enemy afraid of the darkness. The Germans thought they were hunting trapped animals. Moorehead would show them that trapped animals with teeth were the most dangerous kind. The officers nodded. They understood their men. Back home, most of these soldiers had jobs that required them to work alone in dangerous places. Stockmen rode for days across empty land watching cattle. Miners went deep underground where cave-ins could bury them alive. Timber cutters felled giant trees that could crush them in seconds. These men knew how to handle fear. They knew how to stay calm when everything went wrong. But Moorehead also knew something else about his troops. The Australian military had standards that surprised people. Every soldier accepted into combat units had to stand at least 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had to weigh at least 170 pounds. He had to pass physical tests that broke men from softer places. The army did not want just anyone. They wanted the strongest. And Australia, with its brutal climate and harsh living conditions, produced very strong men. The first real test came fast. On April 13th, German forces launched a massive assault. 5,000 men attacked with Panzer tanks leading the way. The Panzers were monsters of steel that weighed 20 tons each. Their tracks chewed up the desert sand. Their guns could punch holes through concrete walls. The sound of their engines mixed with the screaming of Stuka dive bombers overhead. The noise was so loud that men had to shout directly into each other's ears to be heard. The Australian trenches shook. Dirt rained down from the walls. Shells exploded so close that the blast waves knocked men off their feet. The smell of explosives filled the air, thick and choking. Smoke drifted across the battlefield in dark clouds. Through the smoke came the Germans, hundreds of them, running and firing as they advanced. The Australians waited. They had dug their trenches in a network that stretched for 850 yards. Every position connected to another position. If the Germans took one section, defenders could fall back and attack from the sides. Moorehead had learned this in the First World War. Modern weapons killed so efficiently that the only way to survive was to think of the ground itself as a weapon. When the Germans got close enough, the Australians opened fire. Machine guns rattled, rifles cracked. Mortars lobbed shells in high arcs that dropped right on top of the advancing troops. The Germans had expected the defenders to panic and run. Instead, they ran into a wall of bullets and explosives. The attack lasted 2 days. When it finally ended on April 14th, more than 1,200 German soldiers lay dead or wounded in the sand. The Australians had lost 250 men. The math was brutal and clear. For every Australian who fell, 5 Germans fell. That night, a German officer sat in his tent, writing in the official war diary. His hand shook slightly as he wrote the words. The Australians fight with exceptional ferocity and skill. He read the sentence again. Ferocity, skill. These were not words anyone had expected to use about colonial troops. But the officer had seen the battlefield. He had watched his own men retreat in confusion. He had heard the screams. The words were true, even if they were hard to write. Inside Tobruk, life became a test of endurance. British ships had tried to bring in supplies, but German bombers had destroyed 70% of everything stored in the harbor. Food was scarce. Medicine was scarce. Ammunition had to be rationed carefully. Worst of all was the water. In the desert, water meant life. Each man received 1 gallon per day, 1 gallon for drinking, washing, and cooking. Back home in Australia, people used 50 gallons a day without thinking about it. Here, men learned to brush their teeth with a single mouthful. They learned to shave without water. They learned to ignore thirst until their tongues felt like leather. The defenders built their survival system carefully. They dug underground bunkers that stayed cooler during the day. They created a rotation schedule where every man got rest time in the deeper holes. They worked 24 hours in cycles so that fresh troops always manned the defenses. The German attacks kept coming, but the system held. In London, Winston Churchill followed the siege closely. His advisors showed him maps with arrows pointing at Tobruk from every direction. The small port looked like an island in a sea of German forces. Churchill studied the maps and made his decision. He sent a message that traveled thousands of miles by radio. Tobruk must be held at all costs. Those words changed everything. Now the world was watching. Now the siege was not just a military problem, it was a symbol. If Tobruk fell, people would believe that nothing could stop the German advance. If Tobruk held, people would believe that Hitler could be beaten. The Australians read Churchill's message and shrugged. They were already planning to hold. They did not need permission from London, but the attention meant that supplies would keep coming. It meant that the Royal Navy would risk ships and sailors to bring food and bullets across the Mediterranean Sea. It meant they were not forgotten. Through April and into May, the pattern continued. Germans attacked, Australians defended. At night, Australian patrols slipped out into the darkness. They moved silently across the sand. They wore dark clothes and carried knives along with their rifles. Some had grown up hunting kangaroos in the bush. They knew how to move without sound. They knew how to get close to prey without being detected. Now the prey wore German uniforms. These night raids terrified the enemy. German soldiers started to fear sunset. They posted extra guards. They fired at shadows. They jumped at sounds. One German captain wrote in a letter home that the Australians were like ghosts who appeared from nowhere, killed and vanished. Another wrote that his men could not sleep anymore because they expected knives in the dark. By June, the Germans had launched 4 major offensives. All 4 had failed. The commanders could not understand it. They had more men, they had more tanks, they had more of everything except one thing. They did not have men who had been forged by the Australian outback. They did not have soldiers who thought 1 gallon of water per day in 140-degree heat was just another day of hard work. They did not have troops who had spent their whole lives proving they were tough enough to survive in a land that killed the weak without mercy. The numbers told a story that German commanders did not want to believe. Before the siege began, their best military minds had predicted Tobruk would fall in 3 days, maybe a week if the defenders fought hard. Now it was June, and the siege had lasted 2 months. 36,000 Allied troops, most of them Australian, were holding off more than 100,000 Axis soldiers. The mathematics made no sense. The reality made even less sense. Every morning, Rommel looked at casualty reports that grew longer each day. His forces had launched attack after attack. They had thrown tanks and men and bombs at the Australian positions. The results were always the same. High German casualties, minimal ground gained. The Australians gave up dirt 1 inch at a time, and they made the Germans pay in blood for every inch. Then in early June, something happened that changed everything. A German patrol captured its first group of Australian prisoners. 20 men, wounded and out of ammunition, surrendered near the eastern perimeter. Guards marched them back to a prisoner of war camp 50 miles behind the front lines. When the Australians arrived, German soldiers stopped what they were doing and stared. The prisoners did not look like the men described in intelligence files. They were enormous. Most stood over 6 feet tall. Their shoulders were wide as barn doors. Their arms showed muscles that looked like they had been carved from stone. Even after weeks of limited food and water, even after being wounded and exhausted, these men looked like they could bend iron bars with their bare hands. The German guards, who considered themselves physically fit soldiers, felt small standing next to them. A German doctor was called to examine the prisoners and treat their wounds. He brought measuring tools and medical instruments. What he discovered shocked him so much that he wrote a detailed report and sent it up the chain of command. The average height of the Australian prisoners was over 6 feet. The average weight was 185 pounds, and almost none of that weight was fat. It was muscle and bone. When the doctor measured bone density, he found numbers higher than anything in his medical textbooks. When he tested grip strength, the Australians scored far above normal ranges. These were not regular soldiers. These were physical specimens, unlike anything the German military had encountered. The doctor's report traveled from desk to desk until it reached high command. Officers read it with confusion and growing concern. How had intelligence been so wrong? The files said Australians were soft colonials from a peaceful place. The files said they were descendants of criminals with no military tradition. But the evidence standing in prison camps told a completely different story. These men had been built by something the Germans did not understand. Something in Australia itself had created warriors. Word spread through the German ranks. Soldiers who fought against the Australians told stories around campfires at night. They described enemies who did not break under artillery fire. They talked about night raids where Australians appeared like demons from the darkness, killed with brutal efficiency, and vanished before anyone could react. They mentioned the heat, how it climbed to 140 degrees inside the metal tanks, and how the Australians seemed comfortable in temperatures that made Germans sick and dizzy. The smell of the desert became mixed with the smell of fear. Cordite from exploded shells left a bitter taste in the air. Sand got into everything, into food and water and weapons. Dust storms rolled across the battlefield, turning day into twilight, filling lungs and eyes with grit. Through it all, the Australians kept fighting. They held their 30 square mile perimeter like it was the most valuable land on earth. In Berlin, the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels faced an unexpected problem. His radio broadcasts had been calling the Australians soft colonials and convict descendants. The goal was to make German soldiers feel superior and confident. But now, those same soldiers were coming back from North Africa with very different stories. They were telling people that the Australians were the toughest fighters they had ever faced. They were saying that the enemy was not weak at all. This was bad for German morale. It made the propaganda look like lies. Goebbels issued a new directive. Stop calling them soft colonials. Stop mentioning criminals and convicts. Do not say anything that makes these enemies sound weak. German soldiers needed to believe they were fighting worthy opponents, not facing humiliation from supposedly inferior troops. The change in propaganda was an admission that something had gone terribly wrong with German assumptions. Rommel himself began to understand. He was a brilliant commander who respected tough opponents. In his private diary, he wrote words that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. The Australians are extraordinarily tough fighters. The German soldier has found his master here. When Rommel called someone his master, it meant something. This was the man who had conquered France. This was the desert fox, feared across Europe. And now he was writing that his soldiers had met their match in men from the far side of the world. The siege ground on through the burning summer months. Rommel committed 15,000 more troops to breaking the defenses. He sent 50 additional tanks. The Italian dictator Mussolini demanded that Tobruk fall immediately. The port had become a symbol of Axis strength or weakness. If they could not take one small city defended by colonials, what did that say about their armies? What did it say about their dreams of empire? But the Australians would not break. By August, German casualties had climbed past 8,000 men. 8,000 soldiers killed or wounded trying to capture 30 square miles. The number was staggering. The cost was unbearable. And still, the Rats of Tobruk, as they now called themselves, held firm. The nickname had come from German propaganda that backfired spectacularly. A radio announcer had called the defenders rats trapped in a hole. The Australians loved it. They adopted the name with pride. They painted rats on their vehicles. They drew rats on their helmets. They were rats, they said, and rats were survivors. Rats were tough. Rats bit back when cornered. The insult became a badge of honor. German commanders tried different approaches. They attempted to cut supply lines. But the Royal Navy kept making dangerous runs across the Mediterranean. British ships dodged submarines and bombers to bring food, water, ammunition, and mail to the defenders. Sometimes the ships got through. Sometimes they sank in dark water with all hands lost. But enough supplies arrived to keep Tobruk alive. The Luftwaffe dropped more than 2,000 tons of bombs on the city. The sound of explosions became so constant that men stopped flinching at nearby blasts. Buildings collapsed into rubble. The harbor burned. The ground shook day and night like an earthquake that never stopped. But underground, in bunkers carved 15 feet deep into stone and sand, the Australians waited out the storms of fire and steel. When the bombers left, the defenders climbed back to their positions and kept fighting. Winter approached. The siege had lasted 8 months. What was supposed to take 3 days had consumed most of a year. The German advance toward Egypt had stopped completely. Rommel needed Tobruk's port to supply his armies, but he could not take it. Without it, he could not push forward. The entire North African campaign had stalled because 36,000 men refused to surrender, because men raised under the brutal Australian sun had learned lessons about toughness that no military academy could teach. Because sometimes the strongest army is not the one with the best weapons or the most training, but the one with soldiers who simply will not quit no matter what hell rains down on them. December 1941. The siege of Tobruk finally ended after 241 days. It was the longest siege in British Commonwealth history. Relief. Forces pushed through from Egypt, and the Australians who had held the line for 8 months were finally allowed to leave. They walked out of their trenches thin and exhausted, their uniforms faded to nothing, their boots held together with wire and hope. But they walked out as victors. The port still flew Allied flags. The defences still stood. More than 3,000 Australians had been killed or wounded, but they had done what everyone said was impossible. They had stopped the unstoppable German war machine. The cost to Germany was devastating. Rommel's advance had been delayed by 8 months, 8 crucial months when he could have pushed to the Suez Canal, 8 months when he could have linked up with German forces fighting in the Caucasus region of Russia. 8 months that changed the entire direction of the war in North Africa. Military historians would later calculate that if Tobruk had fallen in 3 days as expected, Rommel might have reached the Suez Canal by summer. He might have cut off Britain's oil supplies from the Middle East. He might have changed the outcome of the entire war. Instead, he sat outside one small port city and bled his army white against men he had mocked as soft colonials. The Australian reputation transformed overnight. Before Tobruk, many military leaders saw them as second-rate troops from a backwater country. After Tobruk, military academies around the world began studying Australian combat methods. Officers wanted to know how these soldiers fought. They wanted to understand the training that produced such toughness. They wanted to copy the aggressive defense tactics that Moorshead had used. The siege became required reading for anyone studying defensive warfare. The physical standards that created these soldiers became a blueprint for elite fighting forces. After the war, when countries started forming special operations units, they looked at Australian selection requirements. The minimum height of 5 feet 10 inches, the minimum weight of 170 pounds, the brutal physical tests that eliminated anyone who was not strong enough. These standards influenced how modern special forces units like the Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and British SAS chose their soldiers. The idea was simple. Start with men who are already physically exceptional, then make them even tougher through training. Leslie Moorshead went on to greater things. He was promoted to Lieutenant General and commanded Australian forces at the Battle of El Alamein, where Rommel was finally defeated in North Africa. Later, Moorshead led Australian troops fighting against Japan in the Pacific. He survived the war and returned home to Australia. In 1959, he was knighted and became Sir Leslie Moorshead. But despite the honours and the medals, he remained the quiet former teacher he had always been. He never boasted about Tobruk. He never claimed to be a genius. He simply said that he had commanded the finest soldiers any general could ask for, and they had done the rest. Rommel never forgot the lesson. Years after the siege, he wrote in his memoirs about the Australians. "If I had to take Tobruk again," he wrote, "I would require an entire additional panzer division." Coming from Rommel, this was an enormous admission. A panzer division contained more than 15,000 men and hundreds of tanks. He was saying that to defeat the Australians, he would have needed to bring overwhelming force. Even then, he was not sure he would have won. The man who conquered France with lightning speed had been stopped cold by men from the far edge of the world. The story of Tobruk revealed something important about assumptions and prejudice. The German generals had looked at files and numbers and made decisions based on what they thought they knew. They saw that Australians came from a former prison colony. They saw that Australia was peaceful and far from European military traditions. They assumed this meant the soldiers would be weak. But assumptions are dangerous things in war. The Germans never asked the right questions. They never wondered what it meant to grow up in a country where summer temperatures reached 120 degrees. They never considered what happened to men who worked alone in the outback for months at a time, where a single mistake could mean death. They never thought about how an entire continent could be a training ground for toughness. The Australian environment had done what no military academy could do. It had sorted out the weak before they ever put on a uniform. Boys who grew up on sheep stations learned to handle isolation and hardship before they were teenagers. Men who worked in mines learned that fear was something you pushed through, not something that stopped you. Stockmen who rode across endless deserts learned that your body could do more than your mind thought possible. All of this happened before anyone taught them how to fire a rifle or dig a trench. By the time they became soldiers, they were already warriors. The military just gave them weapons and direction. Today, the Australian Defence Force maintains some of the most demanding selection standards in the world. The Special Air Service Regiment, Australia's elite Special Forces unit, puts candidates through tests that break most men who attempt them. The standards are a direct legacy of what was learned at Tobruk. Physical toughness matters, mental resilience matters. The ability to function when everything goes wrong matters more than textbook knowledge or parade ground discipline. Modern special operations forces around the globe have adopted these principles. They all learned from the rats of Tobruk. The siege also taught something deeper about innovation and adaptability. Mooreshead's aggressive defense was not in any manual. No military textbook said that surrounded troops should launch constant night raids. Conventional wisdom said to dig in, conserve strength, and wait for rescue. But Mooreshead understood that conventional wisdom gets you killed when facing overwhelming odds. He understood that his men were not conventional soldiers, so they should not fight in conventional ways. Innovation came from understanding who his troops were and what they could do that the enemy could not. The lesson applies far beyond military matters. What happened at Tobruk connects to challenges people face today. When experts tell you something is impossible, they might be wrong. When authorities dismiss you based on assumptions about your background, they might be making a terrible mistake. When conventional wisdom says you should act one way, there might be a better path that no one has considered yet. The Australians won because they refused to accept what others said about them. They won because their real strength came from places the experts never thought to look. They won because toughness forged in real hardship beats theoretical superiority every single time. In the end, what the German generals learned too late is what history teaches us clearly. True strength is not forged in comfortable places. It is not built by following traditions or reading books about warfare. True strength is hammered into people by the land itself, by the challenges they face every day, by the hardships that force them to become harder. The Australians were not soldiers who happened to be tough. They were tough men who became soldiers. And when the desert sun beat down on Tobruk's dusty perimeter, when 88mm shells screamed overhead and Panzer tanks rumbled in the darkness, those mocked colonials proved that mockery is the luxury of the ignorant, and respect is the lesson written in blood and sand. The strongest chains are forged in the hottest fires, and no fire burns hotter than the Australian sun.